Hi everybody, my name is Milligan. I'm an Associate Professor of History at the University of Waterloo, and today I'm going to be talking about the National Library of Canada's Electronic Publication Pilot Project and its enduring contribution to web archiving. If you have any follow-up questions, my email is i2millig@uwaterloo.ca. Also looking forward to talking during the live session as well, and of course you can always tweet at me at ianmilligan1 on Twitter. But I want to begin by talking a little bit about my broader project, which is an exploration of averting the digital dark age. I'm curious about the rise of network communication, of the web and the internet, and how these new mediums are received by libraries, archives, and historians. How did we go from the web arising in 1991, being popular-ish in 1993 and 1994, to being the subject of widespread web archiving and preservation by 1996 and 1997. Why did web archiving start at the Internet Archive, in Sweden, in Australia, and of course, in Canada, within such a relatively short time span? We don't really understand how this all happened, save for probably too much emphasis in the historiography on the Internet Archive as a trailblazer, which neglects the fact that Canada was actually the leader in this field in 1994. What intellectual currents were at play? In this broader project, I argue that this all gave rise to the idea of the digital dark age. The idea in the 1990s that if society went into networks, but our memory institutions did not, there'd be this massive loss of our cultural record. And so my project is about the forces that go into averting it in the 1990s. Now, all of this is important because networked communication poses a specific challenge. That we're particularly concerned about the ephemerality of the web, which is a growing medium. If in 1994 there were only 2,500 websites, by 1996 there were 250,000, by 1997 there were over 1 million. And it could all be gone in an instant. Poof! A server fee not paid, a student creates a web presence and graduates from their institution, a server crashes. All of this might mean the loss of priceless cultural information that would be key not just to understanding the evolution of the web and the internet, but maybe our culture itself, higher education and beyond. And by 1996, it was clear that this wouldn't just be a few disappointed geeks, but we might see the collective imperilment of Western culture. And the 404 not found error that appeared in people's web browsers might become an evocative symbol that the web and our cultural memory was in peril. Now, understanding the rise of these organizations, like the program I'm talking about today, touches on the history of archives, broadly defined, because we are, of course, talking about libraries as well. And I think it's really important for historians to study and understand the archives that shape their work. Historians are expert users of archives, but archivists co-create historical knowledge through their selection, arrangement, and description of archival content. If in the 1920s archival theory was defined by custodialism, archivists as stewards or handmaidens of historical content, by the 1970s their shift to post-custodialism began to understand the activist role of archivists to transform and shape the record. That archivists will co-create historical knowledge, and so we need to understand that co-creation if we are to write proper histories. And these pressures that we see beginning, really, custodialism is always a bit of an unachievable myth, sort of like the noble dream of objectivity. The digital abundance of the web age and electronic records more generally, even earlier in the 1980s, begins to accelerate this transformation. And I think it's important to note that, historians, myself included until relatively recently, I think still sometimes act as if the archive is custodialist, that we are sort of working with historical knowledge that's been passed along by the archivist, and we don't think about the work that goes into shaping this record. And so a lot of this work where I'm studying cultural memory institutions is really informed by the argument by Bluin and Rosenberg in 2011 that any visit by a historian to an archival institution is now an exercise in interdisciplinarity. Now by the 1970s, and this is in Canada, the United States, England, and beyond, we're seeing an increasing divorce between historians and archivists professionally. The archive section of the Canadian Historical Association goes off to form the Association of Canadian Archivists in the 1970s in Canada as well. Part of the tension here, I think, comes from the social and cultural turn, that historians say we want to preserve everything. Sit on a committee with a historian at Library and Archives Canada, we say preserve everything. And that's, of course, really tough. It's mainly informed by the social and cultural turn. Our objects of historical inquiry are so broad and monumental that really almost anything could be interesting or useful for historians. And that makes it really hard to work with us. Because we want to preserve everything, archivists operate in a scarcity economy. They must make decisions. How much ephemera to keep, for example, and what is ephemera? Two questions that will be key for the discussion we have today. And so the standard narrative of web archiving then is really just hand-wavy. Books and journal articles, my own book included, History in the Age of Pundits from 2019. In 1996, the Internet Archive was formed, so were some projects in Australia and Sweden. I do that, everybody in the field does it. We don't actually inquire where our archive comes from, we just talk about really briefly that it was formed in 1996. And so as I mentioned, my digging into this was first of all asking, okay, well, why did the Internet Archive form in 1996? And why did national libraries in Australia and Sweden do the same thing? What inspirations did they draw from? Was there a common link? And something kept coming up. Canada! And I thought, how convenient, because I am Canadian, and I thought there was actually no real Canadian link to this project, which was funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Researchers Council of Canada. I'm really excited. Canada keeps coming up, and specifically the National Library of Canada keeps coming up as an inspiration in these web archiving programs. Now, a little bit of context on the National Library of Canada. Many of you, some people in the audience will have been to the National Library of Canada back when it was an independent institution. Of course, now it's part of our combined National Library and National Archives, Library and Archives Canada. So the National Library of Canada was established in 1954, and it's a long-term leader in information policy and digital libraries more generally. And arguably, part of this is due to Canada's position vis-a-vis the United States, as well as our decentralized federation. We become leaders in preservation, but crucially, a big part of preserving data is making it transferable and just making it interoperable. And if you've got to navigate 10 provinces and territorial governments and different sort of approaches to records, and you have to funnel data across the United States-Canada border, you actually become really, really good at the interoperability of content. We're used to navigating and sort of thinking about how to interoperate data. And so Canada becomes this leader internationally. We host some international organizations in Ottawa around the transfer and interoperability of data. And related to that, Canada is an early adopter in digital content, and by 1994, all government publications are moving towards digital availability. And the National Library of Canada is helped by a fairly expansive act of enabling legislation, the National Library of Canada Act from 1954. The National Library of Canada is given a mandate to collect books. But crucially, even as early as 1954, book is defined very broadly. That the Act itself implicitly defines book as inclusive of library matter of every kind, nature, and description. In 1969, it is amended to include, quote-unquote, any document, paper record, tape, or other thing published by a publisher. Begins to acquire sound. In 1998, microfilm, which is another big part of my project, actually microfilm history. And by 1993, we're seeing the collection of videos and CD-ROMs. And so it's expanding, and so as we get into 1994, the question begins to be asked, what about internet and web-based content? And that's because in 1994, the world of publishing was changing. This is a period where the internet is in flux. Most people are beginning to use the web to access the internet, but there are other protocols as well, such as Gopher or the Wide Area Information System, or FTP, which some of you may have used. The web is just one way to access the internet. There's lots of stuff going on the internet, but it's clear that it is changing the world of publishing. That scholarly journals are beginning to share their articles by 1994. That we're seeing novel forms of electronic books, experimenting with hypertext and new ideas of linearity, etc. And already people are beginning to wonder, what about these new websites? Is this the next phase of the book? And so in 1994, the Electronic Publication Pilot Project is launched, and it's really designed to explore, perfect for my broader project, what the world of born digital acquisitions would look like. And two things are really consequential in the way they set up this pilot project. First of all, they broadly define electronic. Electronic records, I don't have time, it's a whole segue of what an electronic record is. You can go narrow, you can go broad, and the National Library of Canada goes broad. They say electronic is those are distributed in multiple copies on physical media, and, this is crucial, those that reside on a host computer and are accessible over a communications network. But they take that broadness of electronic and couple it with a narrow interpretation of publication, arguing that their idea of a publication would be only those that have undergone the same formal preparation activities associated with traditional print publications. And this would be a critical distinction, because of course electronic publishing didn't necessarily have the same gatekeepers that traditional publishing did. But the EPP had 6 goals. They wanted to understand the issues, they wanted to develop knowledge around online documents, they wanted to see what broader policies would look like, they wanted to build the government information role, provide input, and of course crucially, gain general institutional experience with internet publishing. And the reason the EPP was so significant is that it was really, and I would underscore this dramatically, it was the first project in the world to explore how to crawl this material and to trace out what a web archiving program would look like. When we think about the Internet Archive, when we think about Australia and Sweden and all these other things, I don't expect anybody in the audience to really know this historiography, almost nobody mentions Canada. There's some exceptions, but Canada plays a significant role because it's the first people in the world to actually try to do this, alongside the Dutch in a much smaller pilot project. And so it all comes out. It's a pilot project. One of the people I was interviewing for this mentioned, the 90s were, of course, the era of the federal government pilot project. And this final report really laid out was the enduring significant impact of this project. And so the final report, which is available online, comes out in June 1996. It explores many of the issues that would be foundational to the next 5 years of web archiving through to about 2001. Raising the issue of copyright, realizing that lots of different file formats were used in network communication, and if you wanted to take an obscure file format, let's say a WordStar file, and you wanted to convert it into something like a PDF to make it long-term viable, that might require breaking copyright. Versioning. What happens when 3 versions of the same document have been put online? Which one is canonical? The question of legal deposit, which we grapple with today. Should legal deposit be expanded to include digital records? And even cataloging. How to expand catalog fields to include all of these things? Would the traditional catalog fields set up in the 1960s really handle electronic objects well? And in that final report, the narrowness of publication continued. That on the web, they said, a publication needed to have the characteristics of traditional publications if it was to be in the mandate of the National Library. And that meant journals, not homepages. Things that resembled conventional publications, not ephemera. And it's difficult to do this, and the formal report even says, essentially, you'll know it when you see it. That's how we know if it should be collected by the National Library or if it is doomed to the digital dustbin. And this meant necessarily that the role of a national library in collecting the web needed to be selective rather than comprehensive. And once we get into selective, we run into trouble. The final report is clear. Electronic publication should be acquired on a selective basis. And this would be the EPPP's enduring legacy over the next decade to come. And we'll see this quotation here from the EPP final report. It says, what do you do? What does it mean to be selective when you collect the web? If you wanted to do... So the problem is you have a document, and the documents have links. We all know how the web works. Documents have links. If you grab that document, but you do not grab the things that it links to, are you truly grab that document? Or is the experience of reading that document so tied up in the ability to follow these links and learn these things that you are not doing justice to a document if you don't grab the things that it is linking to? And so the report goes into detail on this, says, hey, you could grab them all. You could grab just some, those that go to Canadian sites or Canadian publications, or you could grab none. You could pretend it's like grabbing the TV guide. You knew that there were things on Channel 6, but you don't actually grab the copy of what was on Channel 6. You just grab the index of it. And so if we draw this little map here, if we have this website here, and these are all the things that it's linking to, the EPPP report essentially said, draw a line around it. Just grab this, and don't grab the peripheral objects as well. And this laid out some significant legacies. Some positive, some negative. So I'll start the positive, and then we'll talk about the negative of what we had from this, approach to web archiving. So on the positive, we got the Library and Archives Canada Act of 2004. So National Archives of Canada, the National Library of Canada came together. That piece of legislation I view as a very forward-thinking, progressive piece of enabling library legislation. It's 2004, and already the Library and Archives Canada Act is thinking ahead. It gives LEC the power to take a quote-unquote representative sample to the documentary material of interest to Canada that is accessible to the public without restriction through the internet or any similar medium, and also expands legal deposit to publications that use a medium other than paper. I only have about 3 minutes left, but I can assure you this is an outlier in its progressiveness and expansiveness in the world in 2004. And then they continue. And today, it's had its ups and downs, its own web archiving program. They didn't really get it back into web archiving en masse until 2005. They primarily collect government data. They now do significant curated collections. And as of 2019, they are, hopefully continuing to... as of 2019, they had something around 50 terabytes of web archives. About half from federal government websites. So it's small, but there's moves afoot to make it a bit bigger. Beyond Canada, however, I think the international legacies are the most significant. That in Australia, I've mentioned them a few times, they're seen as a sort of outside the Internet Archive big leaders. They launched their Preserving and Accessing Network Documentary Resources of Australia project. It's really just a complicated way to use the acronym Pandora. One of these backronyms. They came up with the acronym first and came up with the name. And then they all got sick of making Pandora's box jokes for a decade. But when Pandora pops up in 1996, it's explicitly based on the intellectual framework of Library and Archives Canada's Selective Web Archiving Project. This is a retrospective written by their managers. That they decided to draw on Canadian experiences. They decided to take a selective approach to web archiving. The Swedes would take a comprehensive approach, as would the Internet Archive. And so I would say that, really, and this gets into the weeds for a Canadian History Conference, really leaves an institutional legacy with considerable impact on the global web archiving community. That Canada, really through this story, emerged as a pioneer in the web archiving space. It set out a vision of selective web archiving which dominated the ways that national libraries would approach the web for the next decade. And crucially, it would help lay the foundation for expansive legal deposit and web crawling. Hopefully soon, this will come to Canada, and we'll be able to really build on the legacy that the EPPP laid down in the early 1990s. And I would really love to see Canada reclaim its spot as a leader in born digital collection and preservation. So at that point, as we near the 20-minute mark, I will thank you all for listening. I'm looking forward to the discussion we have. I, of course, would like to acknowledge the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, both for this research and, of course, for making this conference possible. So thank you, and really looking forward to our discussion.